Welcome to the Contrarians, and tonight Tim Durling is back. He's got a brand new book release titled Red on Black, The Listener's Guide to Sammy Hagar. So Tim's here in the studio. We're going to talk about the book a bit. Let's get started. Let's go. Welcome to the Contrarians, and look, we have a familiar face that we've always seen in the Contrarians for so long. Tim Durling is here, and Tim has a new book out, and we're going to have a little discussion about it. A new Sammy Hagar book. And if anybody knows me, I love Sammy Hagar, and I love Tim Durling. So Tim, how are you? Nice to see you. Welcome to the show. So you've been awfully prolific lately.
Yeah, look, I don't know how it happened, Grant. Thanks for having me on. 4 books in 3 years is pretty amazing.
That's a lot.
3 years, 4 years ago, it didn't enter my head, right? But yeah, I'm enjoying it, and seems to be going well, and people seem to be enjoying them. So I think I'm going to keep at this.
I would if I were you. So the new book, Red on Black: A Listener's Guide to Sammy Hagar. So in this book, you cover multitude of Sammy's career. We've got Van Halen in here, correct?
Yeah, it's primarily on his solo albums, but yeah, there's a chapter on Van Halen, there's a chapter on Chickenfoot, and there's a chapter on Montrose, but each chapter devoted to each of his solo albums, whether it's Sammy and the Wabos, whether it's, The Circle. I consider those all solo albums, and there's 19 of them. I think a lot of people will be surprised just how many albums he's done, not counting the band situations. And there didn't seem to be a book out there. Like I've said with all my previous books, you can see another book like it. So I've been a fan for a long time. I thought, this might be a good time to do it,
I think the closest I've ever seen are just record reviews of his stuff, but never anything quite like this. So this definitely fills a niche. So you're going back all the way back to the Capitol era, through the Geffen era, to just everything. So if you're a big Sammy Hagar, this might be the book for you. So did you decide to do this book because you've been such a heavy Sammy Hagar fan from the beginning, or it just was the fact that there was a niche that needed to be filled?
Probably a little of both. I did, the Unspooled book, and then I did the Y&T book, the response to that. That continues to sell, the Y&T book, which is great. And the Kansas book, I still sell some of that too. And then it came around to Sammy's stuff, and I thought, well, yeah, I've been a fan for a long time. And, Sammy wrote his own book, and then he wrote his little, his party and cookbook. And there's been lots of Van Halen books. Mm-hmm. And, Martin did a great book on Ronnie Montrose, Montrose and Gamma. But there didn't seem to be a book that concentrated on Sammy's solo albums. And to this day, it's not the easiest thing to track down all of those albums. So, like the Y&T and the Kansas books, I thought, let's chronicle each one. Let's list all the songs, and let's really go in depth on each of them. When I say let's, this one is actually different from my books. This one's all me. It's not a panel book this time. I will be returning to the panel format because I like it. But I thought, you know what, I'll do this one myself because there was a lot I wanted to get out. There was a lot I wanted to talk about getting introduced to this solo music, how hard it was to find the albums. But I also, once I started going into each album, especially in his early years, in the Capitol years, there were a lot of, well, first of all, there's a lot of eclecticism. There's a lot of variations in musical styles, but there's also a lot of covers.
Well, but you know what, Tim? Just talking Sammy Hagar, that I really love that early period because it's very eclectic. There's a lot of different styles. And the fact that you've went out and you've documented this in a book and no one else has, I think it's wonderful for the fact that's really the era that I'm most fascinated by. Yeah, everybody knows that Geffen era, heavy metal, a lot of success, but man, a lot of that Capitol era really needs to be brought to people's attention because it's really eclectic, and there's great stuff there to be had. And I do applaud you for going down that road. But yeah, eclectic, that's a good term.
Yeah, I mean, there's there's hard rock stuff similar to what he did with Montrose. There's sort of boogie rock stuff. There's yacht rock. Some of that stuff is yacht rock. There's really odd choices of covers, and I wanted to talk. So each chapter is set up that at the end of the chapter, if there's any songs on his albums that were cover songs, I wanted to talk about, well, here's where they came from, here's who wrote them, here's where you can listen to other versions of them. Or, and this happens a few times, if there's songs on these albums that people have covered from Sammy, I wanted to talk about that. The most famous example, of course, being I've Done Everything for You, which Rick Springfield had a hit with, and that's a Sammy Hagar song. But there's other songs that people have recorded. I mean, everybody from Bette Midler to, just really weird, there's French versions of some of his songs. I really enjoyed doing that part of the research because a lot of that stuff I didn't know until I started looking at Discogs. Just when I looked under Sammy Hagar under, songwriting, and I wanted to see, okay, well, it lists this album by this Dutch group. Why? So I look at it. Oh, they cover, I think it's Red. Things like that. I really wanted to talk about a lot of people covered his songs, and he covered a lot of people's songs. Now, whether that was the record label at the time saying, you got to do this, you got to do that, I don't know. He covered Donovan a couple of times. He covered Patti Smith. Like, he covered a wide variety. Bob Welch, wide variety of songwriters.
Yeah. Well, Otis Redding did Sitting on a Dock of the Bay.
Yeah. Otis, yep.
And that came out like on a greatest hits, but
that came out by itself in I think 78. Capitol just kind of stuck that out by itself. We talked about that
we talked about that.
I can that you could throw that on a yacht rock station and it would fit right in. And plus he's got members of Boston singing background vocals on it, which once you know that, you listen back, well, of course it's Brad Delp and Barry Goodrow.
Of course.
Right? And you actually this is pretty cool. You actually saw Sammy back in this era.
I saw him in 79.
This started our whole April Wine discussion on Grant's Rock Warehouse because you saw, was it Sammy, April Wine, and Scorpions?
Yep.
So
79.
Sammy just at the tail end of that Capitol career. So I imagine
Street Machine tour.
Yeah, so he's doing Trans Am and
it was
This
great.
Planet's on Fire and
Plain Jane.
Yeah. Good stuff.
But he was doing a lot of Montrose because think about it. That was basically the Montrose band was backing him at that point.
Except for Ron. Yeah. He had Church and Denny Carmassi. And he had a solid background band.
It was phenomenal. And they were doing Montrose tracks. Okay. We've probably talked about this before, but I've always backed up Sammy as a guitar player. I think, of course, Ronnie Montrose is a good player, but he could play anything. I don't think Ronnie Montrose really had a sound. So he could play with any band and just kind of blend in. But I think Sammy Hagar, at least that version of that band, I think absolutely wonderful. I didn't miss Ronnie Montrose at all because you had, Sammy can play all that stuff, and he was such a great player. It was great for being a young kid and getting to go to that show.
Yeah,
it was wonderful. But man, that band, that era of the band, that Capitol era, such a good band.
The only time I ever saw Sammy live was with Van Halen. I saw him in '95 on the Balance tour. That's the one time. Sammy's an artist like so many that I like. I mean, I'm here on the East Coast of Canada, and we just don't get all of those groups coming through. I mean, I would have loved to have seen, his latest tour, The Best of All Worlds with Satriani and everybody, but I would have to go to Boston or Toronto. I mean, that's a long way. But anyway, hey, it is what it is. And I really wanted to chronicle all of these albums. I wanted to get down what I thought about them because I'm very honest about it. I'm a huge fan, but not all of the albums I'm a big fan of. So I'm very honest in my reviews, but I do list all the songs and who did them, who wrote them. Here's who played on the album. And now here's, for what it's worth, here's what I think of it. So I think the idea is that if you're just coming into his solo career, and you're a fan of a particular type of music and you read one of my reviews, you might go, this sounds like an album I might like, or maybe I'll wait and get this album later, or, things like that. But I am happy to say that the last couple of albums that he did, so they would have been the Circle albums, Space Between and Crazy Times, I really like both of those albums.
Mm-hmm.
And in a similar way to how much I liked the previous two Kansas albums, the fact that there's still good new music coming out really made me want to document it. If he'd stopped making music 20 years ago, or if the albums he put out were just kind of going through the motions, I don't know how excited I would have been to do a book like this. But stuff has been really consistent, and honestly, most of the albums that I don't like, it's a stylistic thing. Of late, there came a time where Sammy kind of went into the whole hard rock Jimmy Buffett thing, and then he started playing a lot of acoustic, sort of country tinge stuff. It's not really my style, but he's still putting out rock albums too. So, there's a little bit of something for everyone. And yeah, I of course I had to talk about Van Halen. I mean, that's his highest profile thing. And I first heard of him with Van Halen. I'd never heard of him prior to 1986 because I was a kid. But I did want to mainly concentrate on the solo albums and, really talk about each one. Here's when they came out. And, good luck finding them, folks. But, I'm hoping that I can catch people that, maybe they've got, Freelock Box or VOA and the Van Halen albums, maybe they've got Unboxed or one of his best ofs. And they're like, well, yeah, maybe I'll get the songs these albums came off of. What are they? Well, here they are. Here's a nice, succinct, to use a fancy word, format for putting them in. And yeah, I really like how they came out. All the pictures in this, like a lot of my books, they're all from my personal collection. So I've got, I got some 8-track photos in here, and I got some vinyl and some cassettes and some singles. And, I had a really fun time putting it together. I also, I dedicate a chapter to what I call truck stop tapes. And this isn't strictly to do with Sammy, but in the case of how I discovered his back catalog, it kind of has something to do with it. And if people are wondering what I mean by truck stop tapes, I go into a great deal of detail in this chapter about what they are. And, if I say truck stop tapes to you, Grant, do you know what I'm talking about?
I know what you're talking about because there's a lot of those. You go through like a truck stop and they would have these, usually they're like compilations. April Wine comes to mind as a truck stop tape band where they would make like a special compilation and maybe use familiar album art of some kind and kind of bastardize it. And it would be like on a special market, special products label.
Exactly.
And it's just, and they're usually really truncated and there's only like 8 or 7 tracks or something.
You got it. You got it.
Weird.
And Capitol, Capitol was also April Wine's label in the States. So Capitol did a lot of these. I mean, they did it with everybody from the Beach Boys to, artists that didn't have it in their contracts to say, hey, we don't want to see these. We don't want to see these types of things. They're legitimate record company releases, but they're not sanctioned by the artist. And you're right. The artwork typically looks pretty cheap. One of Sammy's myriad compilations that Capitol threw out, they spell his name wrong, for crying out loud. There's one where he's got his name spelled with 2 G's. So, how much care was put into it. But having said that, that was the first thing I could find, those types of cassettes, where I got to hear some of his early music. And in the case of some of the live stuff, that includes some of the early Montrose stuff. So I had to mention it. But, if you're a medium, level Sammy Hagar fan, but you like a good read, a good music read, I think you would enjoy this book. If you're not a Sammy Hagar fan in any capacity, this book is not going to change your mind. But if you've got a couple of his albums and you want to know what else was made, what else he actually did, because a lot of them were, especially in the later careers, he'd switched labels all the time, a little bit like Alice Cooper. So I tried my best to make it as complete as possible and to present something where people could go, okay, well, at least I now know what I'm missing, what I need to look for, and maybe also explain why you see these occasional, and there's CDs too, that, truck stop CDs where you pick it up and you go, that looks kind of cheap. Is this a legitimate thing? So I try to clear up those sort of questions that people maybe didn't even know they had. And of course, the big albums are here, VOA, but I also talk about songs that are associated with this time period. For example, VOA being his biggest solo album. So at the end of that chapter, I also write a little bit about the song The Girl Gets Around, which is on the Footloose soundtrack. That came out in 84. So if there's something pertinent to his career, song-wise, I talk about it as close to that time period as I can.
Yeah. Yeah, it's good. You had a lot of good points there. I just never understood this. For a guy, of course, we know Montrose when they originally were out. Critically acclaimed, great record, don't get me wrong. The Sammy era Montrose, but those records didn't sell. It was just kind of blip on the screen. And then,
Right.
of course, Sammy went solo. And then you listen to that first album, there are a lot of similarities on certain songs. You mentioned it's eclectic. Yeah, there's a lot of different styles, but there's a lot of similarities between some of the tracks on the first Montrose album and the first Sammy Montrose album. It's practically the same band. So,
It is
what I
eventually on the first couple of records, he's got different players on there, but
there's some studio guys.
yeah, but at the same time, it's kind of weird because he's got
Wasn't Bill still? He was still with him though,
Bill
wasn't he?
Church. Yeah, Bill Church, I think, is on most of them. But what's really funny about it is that so Bill Church was the bass player on the debut Montrose album,
Mm-hmm.
and then he was replaced on Paper Money, the second and last, with Sammy on vocals by Alan Fitzgerald, who people will know as Fitz, the keyboard player from Night Ranger. Well, he played bass too. Both of those guys ended up in Sammy's band. So the bass player at Montrose and then the guy that replaced him in Montrose, they both ended up in Sammy's band, which is kind of interesting. Yeah, it's interesting because I kind of wonder when I talk about this in the book, the first Montrose album, yeah, now people look back on it as a classic, one of the best hard rock albums to come out of the 70s, ahead of its time. For 1973, it sounds amazing. Ted Templeman's production. But it wasn't successful.
No.
It was a stiff. And I think that they hit the panic button, and that's why Paper Money isn't as strong, isn't as heavy, isn't as hard rocking, and it's not as acclaimed as that first album. But that first album was your definition of a sleeper hit. It slowly sold. It kept selling. It went gold in 77 and finally went platinum in 86. And I think if that album had been really successful off the bat, well, I mean, we can speculate on what might have been, but if that first album had been successful, and let's say that Ronnie and Sammy still butted heads and he wasn't in the band anymore, I think that Sammy's solo career would have been a little bit more straight ahead hard rock like the Montrose, and I don't think he would have gotten those stylistic diverseness that you get on those early recordings. Right. By the time the Geffen years came around, it was pretty streamlined. And I think that was probably a label mandate that said, don't do anything weird, just write really good songs.
Well,
and for the part, it worked,
And then you had Keith Olsen producing. Well, we've talked about that before. I think Keith Olsen along with Sammy, I think that might have been the perfect blend. Nothing wrong with Carter and his production. I don't have a problem with what he was doing with Sammy at Capitol. Yeah. But for some reason, it seemed like Keith Olsen and Sammy Hagar, Standing Hampton. Come on, that's a great record.
Lockbox, great sounding album.
Great sounding records.
Yeah. Yeah. I don't think it was Carter so much as it was the budget that was given, because Carter or John Carter, he's usually just called Carter. He's worked with a ton of different people.
Motels.
Yeah. Usually Capitol acts, if you look at it. Like I said,
he was a Capitol staff producer.
Yeah. But 9 out of 10 scale was produced by Carter, and it's I describe it as kind of a muffled, claustrophobic kind of, it's a very compressed kind of sound. You get to the second album, the Red Album or the self-titled album, Carter still produced it, but it was produced at Abbey Road, and it sounds a lot better than the first album.
They pumped a little bit more money. They gave them a little bit more money to work with.
And he did okay in the UK. He wasn't a huge star in the UK, but he was able to play places like the Hammersmith Odeon. He got a little bit of attention from I think that he was sort of one of those honorary new wave of British heavy metal guys that was playing this sort of music at the time, and he was touring in the UK a lot. So I think that people kind of adopted him as, because I've seen a lot of those old documentaries on new wave British heavy metal, and the dudes with the patches on the back. You'll have Iron and Motorhead and Jackson, and there'll be a Sammy Hagar patch, which is really, really cool. I think that Montrose album, there was a lot of love for that Montrose album, and I think I tend to think the audience were more in tune, so they followed everybody from that band, and it just, it didn't hurt that Sammy did have, the eclecticism aside, he had songs like Reckless and Don't Stop Me Now, and like we said, Trans Am, This Planet's on Fire. He had songs that were perfect for that sort of crowd. Yeah. He was never a heavy metal artist, but he could rock hard.
Hard rock, he could do that, but that's the thing. He was eclectic. He could do all kinds of stuff.
I mean, the thing is, I joke a little bit about how varied those early albums are, but the thing is, he sings it all really well, right?
Oh, Sammy can sing anything you throw at him. That's what those records show off beautifully.
Yeah, and I think, I think you're right. You raise a point about Sammy as a guitar player. I think he's a perfectly good guitar player. The problem is that through his entire career, he stood alongside. He's a good guitar player, but he's always been in bands with great guitar players. So, there's just a difference. But he's perfectly fine as a guitar player. So you get him and Gary Peel trading solos. It's good stuff. And the fact that early Capitol stuff, none of it certified, it's still hard to find. You can find some reissues, but you still have to kind of pay for them. You never see them just regular. They were never regular things that you saw in stores, right?
A lot of that stuff back in the 90s when, people were dumping all their vinyl collections and I was going through and buying everything.
Yeah.
Because a lot of it was just $1 record, that was the golden era, ladies and gentlemen.
Yeah. Before vinyl, the price of used vinyl went way up. I've said this many times. So Y&T, I had a hard time finding their back catalog, but you kind of expect that with a band like Y&T because they were sort of a big cult band around the world.
Mm-hmm.
Sammy Hagar, at the time that I was listening to his stuff, was a singer for one of the biggest bands in the world, and I had a hard time finding his early material.
And I don't understand that. I understand why you couldn't find it, but I don't understand why Capitol back in the day were, oh my God, we've got Sammy's total back catalog.
Yeah.
And why aren't we monopolizing on this and doing like reissues and putting these out on CD? And a lot of these didn't get like a CD reissue. Let's see, what year did Street Machine finally come out? Like late 80s or early 90s, like 91. That reissue campaign along with April Wine. There was a whole bunch of stuff that kind of came out around that time period, but it was too late.
They just as quick they were out of print because
I never understood it.
Just about the time I tried finding them, they were nowhere to be found.
Yeah.
Basically, it was the Geffen stuff. And the Geffen stuff, I say that, the four albums, but that HSAS album, I had a hard time finding that for many years until it was reissued.
Oh, where's mine? I've got a Target CD of that. The first one, West German.
Yes. There's a Target CD for that and VOA.
I've got both.
Yeah. You're Mr. Target CD.
Well, I've got a whole bunch.
But yeah, that's another thing, and I'm getting a little off topic, but I remember that got reissued about 97. Geffen put it out again, and I was so glad to find it. But they made a big deal about, they do this sometimes. They'll say first time on CD, and then you find out no, it's not the first time on CD. It's just that it's the first time in a long time it's been readily available. That HSAS album is fantastic, and I grouped that because I didn't really know what to do with it. I called that a solo album. I put that in between Three Lockbox and VOA.
The one thing I wanted to bring up, and we've kind of touched on this before, I know we're not talking about the book. We're kind of off on a tangent. But if you go on Discogs and if you're looking for CDs, you probably have a better chance in finding used for anyone looking for Sammy Hagar. And really, we're just trying to turn people onto it. That's what Tim's book's about. That's what the Contrarians about. So what Grant's Rock Warehouse is about, turning you onto these bands. First of all, get Tim's book. Use that as your guide. I'm going to put the link down below. But I think probably your best bet to even go into Sammy Hagar might be finding vinyl because the CDs, a lot of those came out on BGO. The Capitol CDs, a couple of them have came out reissued here, and they're rare as hen's teeth.
Yeah,
I don't, and most of that stuff's out of print. Uh,
hopelessly out of print.
Hopelessly out of print, and I'm just so surprised you just can't get the stuff.
Look,
So, I mean, good luck finding it.
But it's still Sammy Hagar. It's a man, he's people know who he is, right? So,
Right.
and I'm really surprised that Capitol wasn't making deals with the record stores, stuff on the end caps. I'm not talking about the truck stop CDs. I'm talking about the actual honest to God albums, Street Machine and Musical Chairs and All Night Long and the actual albums. And I don't even know if I always have to remind myself, I don't even think 9 out of 10 scale came out on CD on Capitol. I know that Musical Chairs and Street Machine and Danger Zone did, but it's like those April Wine ones, only available for a very, very short amount of time. And I still, to this day, the only actual Capitol CD I have of Sammy's is Rematch. And it's actually, which is the best of they put out in 82 after he went to Geffen. It came out on CD in 87. It's actually called a Rematch and More because it's got some added songs on it, but it's the same cover and everything. That's the only actual Capitol CD I have. You can go on Discogs and find some of them. Like most of mine are, like you said, BGO, which is great. BGO in the UK put most of them out. They've always been, for me, special order things. And even the used vinyl, it is very, very rare, especially in my neck of the woods, that you come across anything from that Capitol era. I found out there in the wild, I found Musical Chairs and Danger Zone, and that was it. The rest I had to order off eBay or Disco.
A lot of those Capitol albums came out in Japan in the early 90s, but they never put them out here.
Yeah.
All of them came out in Japan.
Yeah.
Well, you'll find that. That's a whole other show. But, the Japanese really would, as far as reissue campaigns, really would put things out.
They embrace this type of music, too, like we talked about with Y&T. If it wasn't, God bless them. If it, that's how I got all those A&M albums on CD, because the only versions that existed in the world at that time were the Japanese versions.
I just can't believe it just never had the support, but whatever. It is what it is, but they're out there. Well, Danger Zone 2019 came out on Rock Candy.
Yeah. So
and Rock Candy put out some stuff. So that stuff's out.
Yeah. And those are good ones to get if you don't already have them. And BGO also put out a really good version of really good reissue in 2010 of Loud and Clear. There's a little bit of confusion there, and I try to explain that in the book. Loud and Clear is a live album from 78. It came out in North America under the name All Night Long. It's the same album. It's got a different cover, and they also added a live version of Space Station Number 5. I still would recommend to anybody, if you're curious about Sammy's Capitol stuff, listen to the live stuff. It's live. All Night Long, Loud and Clear, live 1980. It sounds better live, but BGO did a great reissue of Loud and Clear.
My favorite track of All Night Long is Young Girl Blues.
Yeah, which is way better than the version on 9 out of 10 scale.
Oh, but the instrumentation, the way it sounds, it's a perfect late night track.
Yeah.
The guitars are blaring, and Sammy, one of his finest vocal performances as far as I'm concerned, when he sings that. Everyone, please. I did a listening party, and I just played it last week. Go check that out, man. It's so good.
It's Donovan cover, but you'd never know it to hear.
You would never know it's a Donovan cover.
Yeah.
But it's been out on BGO. It's been out on One Way. Rock Candy put it out, but there's never been a quote unquote Capitol CD other than the original.
The label that he was on originally, they've never really done, and I've said this before, I don't know what show I said it on, but Universal, I think, owns all of that stuff now. They've got access to the Capitol and the Geffen stuff. I don't know why there's never been either a box set or at least a 2 CD version, a really nice compilation of Sammy's entire solo career. And, if it was up to, if it's possible, there are things that I would love to see included. such as there's a couple of B-sides from the Standing Hampton era that have never been on CD before. Different things like that would be really cool to have all in one spot. I believe just like I think there's a niche for this book, there's a niche for a really good, like Geffen did a good job with Unboxed for, a 12-song best of. And then in 2004, Universal did a pretty good job with the Essential Red collection, because that did have some of the Capitol stuff on it. It had some of his soundtrack songs like Winner Takes It All, which is pretty cool, Fast Times at Ridgemont High. But I still think that there's a need out there for his stuff to be compiled, officially. You know what I mean? Like a full-on reissue campaign, and here's a 2-disc best of with maybe 2 new songs on it or something like that.
Yeah, it's time.
Yeah,
it's way overdue too. I always call Sammy the hardest working musician and out there. Still out there.
He's 7 years old. He's still, compared to singers that are 20 years younger than him, he still goes out and pulls it off. No, he doesn't sound like he did when he was 30
but he still sounds great.
It's really, really good. And he's still out there doing it, like that's admirable. And again, the last 2 albums he did of new material, I think they're both pretty good. He says he's going to record new music with this band with essentially it's almost like a version of Chickenfoot, because you've got Joe, you've got Michael, and then Jason Bonham left partway through the tour and Kenny Aronoff stepped in. Well, Kenny Aronoff played in the second Chickenfoot tour. I was a big fan of Chickenfoot too. I really thought that had its own sound. I'm up for anything, whatever he puts out.
I love Sammy.
I'll gladly rewrite a chapter if I have to add a new album to it.
Ever since I saw him when I was 13, I've been in,
It's so cool, because I hardly know anyone. You and the Parish of Rock are the only 2 people I've talked to that were into Sammy way back in that.
I bought the T-shirt when I was like in. God, what? Geez, I had a Sammy Hagar shirt, and it was the front. What they sold at the concert was the photo. It said Sammy Hagar and the logo, like on Street Machine.
Yep.
Okay,
yeah.
But it was the shot of him on All Night Long, where he's jumping up with his feet.
Yeah.
That was the T-shirt.
That's cool.
Yeah, and I was wearing that. Man, I was just a kid. Oh yeah.
So there's got to be other people out there that I'm hoping this is the book that people have been waiting for. If they, I've always liked Sammy Hagar. Oh, there's a book that talks about all of his solo albums. That's what this is, I'm really happy with how it came out. Like all my books, my good friend Matt Phillips at Go North Design did a fantastic job designing it. It's got black and white photos throughout, but very well done black and white photos. There's
black and white's fine. You don't need color.
Yeah. You know what? Going to color just drives up the price so much that,
it makes
the fun out of it. You know what I mean? And this black and white stuff comes out really, really good. And besides, I want people to actually buy these albums. That's all I want to do with these books. That's all I want to do with my show. You know what it's like.
Just trying to turn people on to stuff
that they didn't know existed.
Yep.
People might not even know. There might be people out there that think that Standing Hampton's his first album. You know what I mean? Because it was his first big one. But yeah, there's a lot of stuff out there, and he's been very, very prolific post Van Halen. He's never taken that long in between projects. So, I thought it was about time somebody put it together.
All right. So how do we get this book, Tim?
Like all my books, Amazon, wherever you call your local Amazon. If you type in Tim Durling, all 4 of my books will come out. And, one thing that I really, appreciate is when I think this happens, when people get into a band, they'll buy an album and then they'll buy like the 2 previous ones. I'm noticing a spike in my earlier book sales because
nice. Good.
Buy one of my books, then I'll see the Y&T book sell a couple copies of the Kansas one. So it's fantastic. And I just want to share this love of this music. And I think this fills a niche in terms of books about Van Halen. I also want to mention, speaking of books about Van Halen, the foreword of this book is by Mr. Greg Renoff, who author of Van Halen Rising, which is a fascinating look at the period of the band between when they formed in 74 and then their first album came out, because a lot of stuff, that wasn't previously documented, and it's all there, right? So he wrote that book, and then he also did the autobiography of Ted Templeman and oral history. Obviously, that's got a lot more than Van Halen in it. It's got Little Feat and Doobie Brothers and everything, but it's got a lot of Van Halen. It's got Montrose. It's got Sammy solo. So yeah, I was honored to have Greg write the foreword for this book too. And like I said, there's so many great Van Halen books out there. This isn't strictly on Van Halen, but it's in the family, right? So I think
It's
this
all related.
that wasn't previously filled before, right? I'm not competing with Alex. I'm not competing with Alex Van Halen on the market, but yeah, if you're a fan of the era Van Halen and you're curious about his solo stuff, I think this would be a great place to start.
All right, so the links down below. Go to Amazon now. Get the Y&T book. Hey, get the Kansas book while you're at it. Give Tim some love and support, and go out and check out those Sammy Hagar albums if you don't know them. Good luck finding them. They're out there if you look. Man, I'll tell you though, Tim, looking in the used bins, you don't see very much Sammy.
No, you pretty much have to find the used copies. But there's that thrill of the hunt, right? Yeah, every once in a while you might get lucky and find something, and yeah. But I'll tell you, it's a lot easier now with the internet than it was when I was initially looking for them.
Yeah, I'm still a physical media guy. It's all about the thrill of the hunt. If I give up and just go to Spotify, I mean, I would if I have to for a show. Well, I can't find it, but it's the whole thrill of the hunt. I'm still addicted, Tim.
Yeah. I refuse to buy air.
I don't want air.
No, I want the record covers. I want the sleeves, the information, all that.
All right, so everybody, give Tim some love. Link down below. Tim, thanks for coming on. If you'd like to be on these panels, we'd love to have you. We have a Ko-fi, we have a Patreon, we have merch down below. Buy a shirt, for goodness sakes. Get you a Contrarian shirt. Get a Contrarian sweatshirt. It's going to be cold.
Yeah,
do that. But yeah, there's more stuff. I'm going to get this up. There's other shows in the pipeline, but I'm going to get this up for you pronto. So yeah, get your Sammy Hagar book today, Amazon. All right, Tim, nice to see you. Thanks for coming on. We'll see you.